Yesterday was Victory in Europe Day, the 80th anniversary of the end of the war in Europe. The 8th of May 1945 was the day on which Nazi Germany surrendered to the Allies. The Second World War led directly or indirectly to the deaths of between 70 and 85 million people worldwide, and it was, by any measure, the most terrible conflict that mankind has experienced in its long, long history. And my work in conflict prevention diplomacy has inevitably led me to spend a lot of the last few days remembering and reflecting on war, on the awful suffering it inflicts, and what I have myself witnessed and experienced. It's only right that at this time, days like yesterday, that we together as a nation, all of us, mark these anniversaries and remember what happened, as other nations do across the world. However, as that wartime generation, my parents' generation, passes, I've noticed a subtle but highly significant change in the emphasis and the character that such anniversaries and the way we celebrate them or mark them takes. And it's my reflections on that I want to talk about. The wartime generation, as I say, my parents' generation, marked Remembrance Day with, I think, three particular sentiments. Firstly, they remembered the loss of life. They remembered with sad reflection and profound sense of loss those who they had known and who'd made the ultimate sacrifice, and those whose lives had been forever changed, shattered by the war. Secondly, they wanted to ensure that what they and the fallen had endured and sacrificed, and in particular why they had endured that such suffering, was not forgotten by later generations, by you and I and our children and grandchildren. And third, it was a moment of national coming together, a national moment of unity, of mutual support. On the Victory in Europe and Victory in Japan, over Japan anniversaries, they remembered that generation, the relief and the celebration that they experienced at the end of the war, and the end of that struggle, that bloodshed and that suffering, and the fact that we and our allies had vanquished the foe. Victory in Europe Day was a day on which their generation celebrated. They celebrated. Church services were held not only in memory but also in thanks for the victory. Street parties were held. The Union flag or Union Jack flew proudly from almost every home, every shop and every public building. The nation did not mourn loss in an act of collective hand-wringing as we seem to do today increasingly. The nation celebrated. It celebrated victory. That day, Victory in Europe Day, was a time of remembering immense loss, but also immense national pride and thanksgiving. Yes, it was a day tinged with the sad memory of those killed in combat and those who died on the home front in the Blitz and so on. But it was a day on which the nation was grateful. It was a day on which the nation recalled that the sacrifices made were sacrifices made in the name of two great causes. First, the fight of good against evil, and second, the fight to preserve our freedom, to preserve our heritage, to preserve our culture and our way of life, and to free those oppressed peoples who had been subjected to Nazi invasion and rule. But as I reflect and as I think of those losses and why they were incurred, I also worry. I worry that the feelings and the sentiments of my parents' and grandparents' generations are being drowned out. They're being drowned out by a new messaging from a new generation that, thanks to those earlier generations, has never experienced its way of life and its home threatened with destruction. It hasn't got that comprehension of those things. A new generation that is now so multicultural also that the heritage handed down to us by those who fought and died in those wars is simply not appreciated by a large proportion of society because they weren't part of it at the time. And that as a result, society itself appreciates the sacrifice less and less with each passing day. The removal of World War I and World War II from the national curriculum, some 10 years ago or so, has exacerbated the problem. And it means that topics such as the Holocaust are also losing their context and therefore losing their meaning. And as they lose their meaning, they lose their importance in our minds and we lose the lessons learned. I observe that with each passing year, while Victory in Europe Day and indeed Remembrance Day are anniversaries which we rightly use to remind ourselves of the appalling nature of war and the immense suffering that it causes, we omit to reflect on why we fought World War II and indeed World War I. It seems to me that the lesson that my parents' and grandparents' generations wanted future generations to learn and never forget is actually being lost. The increasing emphasis by post-war generations on the suffering, the loss and the cost of war, which is it's a huge part. I'm not in any way underestimating, demeaning or playing that down. It's massive, that loss, that suffering. But it's only one half of the story and it's drowning out the other half. That's what I worry about. What the wartime generations wanted us to remember was not only the sacrifice, but the reason they endured that sacrifice. Remember that the United Kingdom declared war on Germany after Hitler had marched his troops, unprovoked, marched his troops into the Sudetenland and then into Poland. We fought that war because we believed, and that generation believed, in the freedom of sovereign nations to live their lives in peace. We fought against the subjugation of one people by another. We fought for the right of countries to preserve their heritage, preserve their culture, preserve their way of life and preserve their identity. And then later, as the war progressed fairly rapidly, as Hitler marched his armies across Europe to the North French coast, that generation, our parents' generation, my parents' generation and grandparents' generation, they found themselves fighting not only for others, but for our own freedom and survival. For a year, that generation fought and suffered directly in the defence of these islands on their own to protect and preserve their nation's heritage, culture and way of life so that they could hand those things down to future generations, to us, to you and me, to our children and our grandchildren. As I reflect on this 80th anniversary of a landmark at the end of the most terrible war mankind has known, I think about what that generation wanted us to remember, the lesson they wanted us to learn. They wanted us to remember that freedom, the way of life handed down to us as our heritage, and the towns, the cities, the hills, the woods, the seas, and the character of the very people living in these islands are worth protecting, and if necessary, fighting for.